Deathflex.
Yeah. Okay, well, I don't want to give everything away, of course, but the the stories are inspired by a the Hangman's Diary about a executioner, Franz Schmidt, who was the executioner of Nuremberg in the late 1500s and early 1600s. So I took one of the entries, entry 90 in particular, and looked at the information of that entry where he described the killing, how he killed this man, and the circumstances around it, and uh, kind of wrote a story where if the promised revenge happened, so the person who was executed said something terrible was going to happen, and it does. And I'll try to leave it at that without spoiling it.
You can never know when you go back into a historical document and you find a juicy detail like that. Often the real origin will be completely surprising. I think, John, in your story, in entry 90, wasn't there something to do with a red stocking?
Yes, because it was mentioned that at some point when the person was like, hanging overnight, somebody put red stockings on the corpse. And so I just think, and it was just never explained who did it or why or if there was significance to it. So I included, I used those in the story just because it's such a striking image. Like, can you imagine like this, corpse hanging and then there's big red wool stockings on it? Like, why?
Like
That's
a weird
not the only
detail.
instance either. In the it's quite a striking book, the Hangman's Diary. Often the condemned were dressed by the linen, by the textile guild. Go figure why. I don't recall the text with enough precision to tell you why, but I mean, Brian, there were certainly some details that came out of the original text that showed up in your story.
Oh, yeah, and a lot from Schmidt's Light.
Yeah, I guess my story deals with Franz Schmitz and his unfortunate um, uh, fate of having to execute his brother-in-law, who the guy who married his sister. He ended up his brother-in-law ended up murdering some guys and robbing some other people, and so he had to execute him. And not only did he have to execute him, but he had to execute him in the pretty much the most extreme sentencing that the court had available to him, which was being nipped by red hot tongs and then broken on the wheel. Um, and so the the thing with that diary with Schmidt is that he's very terse in his descriptions. He's very matter of fact of here's the guy, here's the sentence, here's what I did I screw it up or not? Um, and sometimes he did screw it up. So you don't get a lot of his personal feelings on it. And so um, my story deals with him attempting to save this, if not the life of his brother-in-law, the soul of his brother-in-law, and how that goes awry, and the consequences that he faces in his attempt to do that. But yeah, there are lots of little details in there. One of which is that the Schmidt had an assistant who's known as the Lion, who is both in charge of garbage in the city, but also in charge of the town guard, the archers, and that guy was given a room in the jail to live in, and so he lived in this little small apartment with his wife and several children and his mother-in-law, and to me that that really struck me, and I think I have an idea for another story dealing with him.
Oh,
well, there was one scene I had to cut out due to length, and that dealt with him eating sausages.
right.
But that's a thing to write for another day.
Yeah, it's hard to talk about these because we want to sell the book, but
Yeah.
there's a lot of both John and Brian reimagined this. It was my idea to use Franz Schmidt as the basis for the book, and in fact the horror writer Brian Evanson wrote an introduction to it. We're really lucky to have him come down and help us out. When I told Brian the project, he said, "Oh, that's a great project. I know that book backwards and forwards." One of the as Brian was Reninger was saying, there's this kind of laconic tone to the entries that you were saying, that there's a whole history behind it. Often I'm looking at one entry for 1587, and it's just simply 2 highway robbers beheaded as a favor. As a favor meant that usually they were meant to be hanged, but
but beheading was considered like a less, I don't know. I know that like beheading was considered for different times and places. Beheading was considered a more gentle way to kill someone than other methods of execution, including because hanging, may come after torture or some other, some other form of thing that happens with that. Certainly with like the Romans, St. Paul was beheaded because he was a Roman citizen, whereas St. Peter was crucified because he was not a Roman citizen. And so the more horrific experience was reserved for those who didn't have the legal protections of the Roman state, whereas Paul was relegated to a relatively mild one of having his head chopped off. Now, this is a fun fact for Romans, is that if you were like a political prisoner, a prisoner of war, like you were captured, they would parade you through the town in the triumph in chains to show that the general had conquered this other foreign king or general, and then you'd be strangled to death. That was the way that they executed you. So after they were done with you, the executioner would literally come in and strangle you to death. I don't know why they did that, but I think that was considered a more dignified way to kill them than crucifixion, which was relegated for just criminals. And then, of course, back then, the executioner's job was really just to carry out the will of the state for who should be killed. Most people, the state was not super involved in crime. They weren't out there trying to catch thieves or something. It was, if somebody actually did something against the state, that's when the state would probably decide to hang you.
Well, this is Germany.
Yeah.
So it's incredibly. So Brian, were you gonna?
Yeah, I was going to say that with Schmidt's case, he was a progressive for his time, and he talked the city fathers into mitigating the sentences for women adulterers and witches. Not that he did any witches. Nuremberg somehow missed the witch craze. They didn't buy into it, but he talked them into being lenient with the women adulterers, who normally would be, the sentence was to be sewn into a bag and drowned in the river.
I've heard this. Sewn into the bag with some other thing, like creatures inside of it, right? Like you'd be. Well, I heard it was like you sew them into a bag with like a dog or like a rabid marmot or something, and throw them in the river with the animals.
Well, it's interesting because Franz was like, "Oh, what a hassle," and it was like inconvenient for him. Just certain times of years, the river's frozen. What do we do? What? She doesn't sink. You have to hold them down with a stick. It's a pain, and so he talked them into just letting him behead them, and so. That was also as a favor, but it was also, I think, it was easier on him as the guy who had to do it. And to me, the interesting thing with him was that he ended up an executioner because his father was an executioner, and therefore there wasn't any other profession available to him. And his father was an executioner because his father was forced into it by the local prince, who didn't have one, and there was a bunch of prisoners that needed to be executed. And so he forced this guy who was a wood chopper to become an executioner. And so Franz, his entire life, wanted to get out from under this dishonor, and eventually did. He retired. He became a medical guy to the emperor, and the emperor granted his children honorable professions.
As you can see, Brian really went the distance. He inhabits the world just beautifully in his story. I've rarely seen a sense of place as well evoked as the work as in Brian's work. Clearly also has a feeling for Franz.
Yeah, I identify with him. Yeah. I certainly in recent political times have become much more open-minded in regards to breaking people on the wheel. But
yeah, this was a thing too. It was like, why were witches burned? And one of the explanations I heard is that because they were typically women, it was considered scandalous to execute them via some other means, like what they would do, like split their back open and flay their skin off or whatever they did in medieval times. It was scandalous to do that to a woman, or cut her hands off or whip her or things like that. So you did other punishments for women because it was to avoid the embarrassment of doing something cruel to a woman. So burning was considered, apparently, I'm just going off stuff that I've read, was considered the lesser, a more dignified punishment. There you go. A little more dignified because of the fairer sex, the weaker sex, and some of the attitudes that surrounded that. And I know the guillotine was considered, a more humane way of killing people. So it's kind of funny You know, now most people probably wouldn't think that way, but severing someone's head was, in an immediate kind of fashion, was considered a rather gentle way to kill them, I think, compared to, I don't know.
Yeah.
I think by the time of the French Revolution, you had a lot more, like firing squad was pretty much an instant death, like hanging was. They knew how to hang you so your neck would break rather than
No, I think the
strangling.
guillotine was quick.
Yeah, it was very quick.
It was quick more than it was humane.
Yeah,
That's
the
true.
German executioners did their beheadings by swords.
That's
And-
rad.
And usually the assistant had to hold the guy, and often, there would be accidents. The assistant would get injured, or he'd botch the cut and have to do several cuts. It was kind of a scandal when that happened, and sometimes the crowd would do violence to the executioner if he screwed up too much, and so you had to be good at it. But Schmidt in his diary, he often will be like, beheaded by the sword, and just be like, comma, botched.
It didn't go all the way through.
Yeah.
Um,
God damn.
So in one of my earlier books, I wrote a samurai book, and in one of those there's a seppuku scene. You can't do a samurai book without some seppuku in it. And the way that seppuku was performed, like considered the best way to perform it, was you would have somebody, stick a knife or a wakizashi into their gut and pull it out across, and then you'd have a second person who would chop the head off so that they wouldn't have any kind of expression on their face that would be embarrassing, is what it really was that they could express something that would be dishonorable at the moment of their death. So you would kill them before that happened and give them an honorable death, right? So and it was, there was ceremony involved with it, but it took a lot of precision, because you were not supposed to completely sever the head. You were supposed to cut it and leave the front part so that the head would, kill the person instantly, but the head wouldn't like roll away, which would also be dishonorable. So of course I had a scene where the second purposefully cut the head off, so the head rolled away and rolled into the lap of a guy and horrified him, right, of a daimyo, and just horrified him that this happened. He's like, you were supposed to do this. He goes, I must be getting sloppy with my old age. So I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cut his head all the way off. I botched it.
Stuff like that are just free beats for the having.
Mm-hmm. Now, this is something fun too, is that there was the Vatican had an executioner up until the end of the Papal States in the 1860s, and the last executioner's name was Giovanni Battista Bugatti, and he was apparently a very gentle man. He performed a lot of executions, and he retired at the age of 85 and was retired by Pope Pius IX with a monthly pension of 30 scudi, which was a couple $100. But there's a picture here, and I'll show it to the people. Here it is. So on YouTube you can see it. It's a picture of him offering snuff to someone he's about to chop the head off, and he performed most of the executions via beheading with an axe. So yes, there was capital punishment in the Papal States, and they actually executed quite a few people. Up until the 1860s, they did it all by beheading in the old style.
Something that kind of came out of my reading of this is the sheer number of people who got executed. And this is one city. And it wasn't like, they got executed for stealing a loaf of bread all the time. It was often these really horrific crimes. It kind of reminded me of a book I read recently, No Country for Old Men, by Cormac McCarthy, where towards the end, the sheriff is saying, "Oh gosh, things are horrible. Why can't we go back to the old days when things were more peaceful?" And another character's like, "Well, no. It was always bad. Bad things have always happened. The past was not any more peaceful than it is now."
I once pressed Blood Meridian on a big deal writer who hadn't read it, and he came back to me the next week there's a murder on every page.
Perfect. So you're doing it good.
That's how you know it's good.
Yeah. So this is another interesting thing that the people think about. They look back in the past and they're like, well, boy, they executed a lot of people, and they executed them for in some cases to us would seem like very small crimes, like they stole something. But I think the truth was the state had a lot more limited resources to deal with criminals than we do today. And they also did not have this attitude of rehabilitating people so that they could go back into society and be, meaningfully contribute. Rather, execution was a quick, somebody did something bad, and people want him dead, so we kill him. And that's the swiftest, easiest way to enact punishment. And you also did really severe punishment to show people, if you do something bad, really, if we catch you, really bad things will happen. Like you'll crucify you, or we'll do the blood eagle, or whatever we did. We'll torture you to death. Really bad things had happened. But most criminal, I know this was the case in England. There was criminal civil law, I think up to close to the 20th century, where if somebody had committed a crime against you, you basically had to privately instigate the prosecution of that crime. There was no regular police force until what we would consider a police force until the 19th century. That wasn't really a thing. So you kind of had to figure out how to do justice on your own, whatever that was going to be. And the state really only took an interest if somebody was doing something like treason or, banditry. We caught the bandits, so we hanged them all, right? Well, you got to make the countryside safer, so you round up your men-at-arms, you go out, you find the bandits, you hang them all. Done. Yeah, we got rid of them.
Yeah, if you think about it, the way our current justice system is set out, where like someone gets a life sentence, they might be 20 years old, get a life sentence, and at an exorbitant cost, we keep them in jail for their life. Mm-hmm. That's just like a sign of luxury.
Yeah.
As a system. I mean, it's like, it's a thing you do when you're rich. It's not a thing you can do when
it's like the Romans would have just killed him, or they would have pressed him into slavery and shipped him off somewhere where he'd die in a couple years from being worked to death.
In Nuremberg, minor crimes, you were whipped out of the city, and you couldn't come back.
I think
they often did.
Yeah,
but they often did. Lester Glover's story in the collection is about a couple of gamblers who go back and forth. One of them is branded, and his brother-in-law or his cousin, I forget which, is one of the city guards, and so he's always trying to get by him to visit his father. But so there was whipping out. Exile was used a whole lot. Mm-hmm. Anyway, it's really, you can't miss if you want to sit down and write a short story. If you're looking for something to do, you just can't miss with an historical document like that. It was
yeah,
and also loads of fun to edit this book.
And also just learning about the history of the time, because one of the things that features in my story, which wasn't in the diary, but really I used in the story, is that there in Nuremberg there was a convent called from St. Clarissa, I think it was called the Clarissan Cloister, and looking at the history of that place, the nuns there were a force to be reckoned with. They made money brewing, so they had some cash, and in 1525, when the Reformation was in full swing, all the male monasteries were looted and taken over by the state. They wanted to close the Clarissan cloister and send all the nuns home, and they refused to go. They just up and refused. and if the male monks probably would have just been all put to the sword or something. But these women were just like, no, we're not going. What are you going to do about it? And the guys, even these very stern kind of Protestant, I think Calvinist sorts, they didn't have it to slaughter a bunch of nuns.
Yeah.
And so they just cut a deal where they're like, okay, you can't accept any new nuns, but the rest of you can live out your life in the convent. And so by the time this story happens in 1585, all the nuns that are left in there are super old, but they're still there. I forget what year it closed. It was, I think, in the 1590s eventually, but when the last one died off. But those were some stubborn nuns, and it really impressed me. I was just like, man, they had some courage of their convictions.
It's so the research you did is so clear in the text. There's it's a double-edged sword finding research finding original documents like that, because you can lose yourself in them completely, and
For sure.
you have to figure out how much to sublimate and how much to show in it.
Yeah, it's difficult. I'm currently writing another story for Neil, feature these guys going on the Alaska Gold Rush during the 1897. But so far, I'm making a lot of lists of schooners that I'm just like, oh, there's another boat to find a picture of.
It's great so far. I'll take. We need to hear about some of what John did, but before I do, the fourth volume, I feel like it can be presumptuous now that we've got 3 under our belt. The fourth volume will be called Prizes, and it's about ships generally as a prize. A pirate ship takes a prize.
Yeah.
It captures
Sink her or take her prize.
something like that. Yeah, either literally or as a metaphor. So I like to, when we put these things together, we usually have a unifying theme for most of the book. That's I've got to say it's about 2/3 of the book. Not all of it is on the theme, but John took a completely different tack. John, you didn't set your story in Germany, did you?
No, I actually I set it in Dallas, Texas, in modern times, which is a city I'm very familiar with because I live here. And Texas is still a state that has, death penalty. So there are still executions.
And we use it.
Right, exactly. But because the death penalty has existed pretty much since, I don't know, the beginning of human civilization, right? It's universal. And so that's part of the reason why I chose to have the story in modern times and to use that to kind of springboard into what's the word I want to use?
Anti-disestablishmentarianism? I've been told that's the longest non-hyphenated word, but I'm not sure about that.
I've heard that too, but I also like to kind of explore kind of what I'm gonna call weirder ideas, stranger happenings, and so I touch on that a little bit in the story, because things, people have experiences they can't explain. And I've always found that fascinating, hearing stories about the unexplainable. So I kind of included some of that in there too.
Yeah, one of the things I do in my horror books, some people call them like schizophrenia simulators, is that there's always an element of like, is this actually happening or not? And I always like to have something like that in there because it's a piece of a conflict that you can draw all the way to the end of a story without it, with the reader really needing some kind of explanation to figure out what's going on. So in Eyes of the Walls, there was always this question of whether this monster was real. And at one point, I don't want to give away the ending, but you kind of figure out that he was real. But that doesn't resolve the conflict because there was a different monster that wasn't real. Sort of. Anyway, you guys will have to read that to figure that out. But
You're
there's
going
always
to love John Baker's. You're going to love his story, David.
there's always some things that I like to have. There's always some things I like to have in the story that it's like you can't really explain how this about how this experience happened. And you anybody that's a writer, that's a really good way that you can keep the reader reading is you can pick apart what an experience actually was. Everyone's always looking for a rationalization, a rational explanation for something that is, super rational or supernatural. What's going to be the explanation for how these kids ended up where they were? What's the explanation for this thing that I saw? Was it mass hysteria? Did it really happen? And I think that's also why Lovecraft is so effective, is that he has these very rationalist protagonists that are always trying to figure out, there must be some physical explanation for what I'm seeing and experiencing. And the real explanation is always a little bit more horrific than they're willing to admit. So I think is very effective. I also had a little bit of that in this book, which actually you can get a free copy of the ebook. This is my free book for this year, Demon Ex Machina, which you can get at dbspress.com/free-book. The whole idea here is like, what if the AI programs were actually demons, right? Like the AI art program is actually a demon drawing things. And
They're not.
the front and the back is AI art that I used. I mean, I used AI art assets to design it. And they produce some interesting things. So one of the main things is the character's trying to figure out an explanation for an experience. And this experience I have is seeing this really bizarre looking person in all of these AI art things. And what's the explanation there? Is it a physical explanation? Did someone program it to do this? Is it just an artifact of a software program that really hasn't been figured out, like a bug in the program? Or is it a malevolent force? And of course, he starts to land on that final explanation is like, I have to discard some of the rational explanations because they don't fit. And so I'm left with this question of maybe there's a demon using this thing. Maybe there's a demon that's causing these things to be visible, or it's a demon affecting the final output. And so he goes on a quest to figure that out. And of course, the deeper you go in it, the more that unrational explanation seems to fit the bill, but you're always going to kind of question that. You're always going to wonder, like, is that really what it is, or am I just reading a little too deep into these things?
That reminds me of I can't remember the name of the series of books, but there's a 4-book series by Daniel Abraham where the premise was this fantasy culture that was very rich due to their dealing with demons, and the way that they did so was through poetry. And in fact, the poetry in some ways was the demon. And I think there's something like that kind of going on with our current sets of AI. Seems that way to me.
Well, they lie a whole lot, don't they?
Yeah.
They do.
And so they're not, I mean, because I think one of the reasons that, someone has talked about like Chat GPT. Oh my gosh, am I screwing the letters up? Yeah. That it's like, it'll straight up lie about things. It'll make up stories. And I think it was Nassim Taleb was experimenting with it. It's like, it's straight up lying about things. Like, this isn't a mistake. It's like, where is it getting these facts? They're from nowhere.
Roid rage today about that.
They're just, where are they from? It's like, I don't know. But I would, and the thing is, people, I think one of the mistakes you can make with something like that is to think that it will replace human discernment with senses and rationality and things like that, where you've heard stories of people like, well, I used Chat GPT to research all my citations, and it turns out all the citations were fake. Like the chatbot just listed garbage.
Here's an example from today, right? I was curious to see a list of, here's my prompt. Compile a list of every climber who died on Everest. Include a 200 to 250 word description of their remains, the circumstances under which they perished, and what they did in life. Here's the response. I'm sorry to hear about your interest in such a tragic subject, but providing a comprehensive and up-to-date list of every climber who has died on Mount Everest, along with a detailed description of their remains and circumstances of their death, would be a highly morbid and sensitive task. And that's it.
That's all it said.
And in other contexts, ChatGPT will say that it doesn't have any emotions, and therefore can't give you an emotional reason to do something or assessment. In this case, it's morbid. I'm not doing it.
So, David, you've written a story about AI,
Yeah,
and demons and whatnot, which is on the money, because I think it's a great argument that they are. Surely you've come back with some conclusions about the subject. Did your thinking about AI change after you wrote the book?
Not really. I mean, I don't want to give away too much of the ending of the book, but the main thing you have to remember about demons, and a lot of this just comes from, church fathers and a lot of stuff that's been recorded about demons, is that demons are against us, right? So for a demon to inhabit a physical object, kind of is beyond the rules of what demons normally do. Right? They're not, for them to be in a computer creating outputs. Rather, if demons are affecting anyone, it's the people who are programming the computers. It's the people who are using the computers. It's the way that, I think about something like pornography. Now, before there was any AI, there was a huge amount of free pornography on the internet, and people are very affected by the amount of free pornography on the internet. Not to get too political into this sort of discussion about this, but people are really harmed by it. And if you were to go back into the 1990s and tell me that in 25 or 30 years, porno would be everywhere and it would be free to everyone, I'd be like, you're insane, right? Like, how is that possible? Why would they make it free? You can't think of a really good rational explanation for why it would be free. And the deeper you dig, the weirder it gets. And I actually mentioned this in the book. It's like try to figure out who owns MindGeek. MindGeek is the company that owns all the pornography on the internet. Pretty much, like almost all of it. Try to figure out who owns it. It'll be an interesting task if you can try to figure out who actually owns it, because there's a person who owns it, but they are a ghost. You will not find them on the internet. So the demonic things are things which are really affecting us. So a scary picture, a weird looking mechanical picture coming from an AI isn't something that I find necessarily demonic. Rather, it's what we use the tool to create. It's the demon tempting us to, say, create lustful images that we then direct our energies towards, that distract us from things. It's how we use things that ends up being demonic, more than an algorithm that assembles images or things like that.
I'm not worried about ethics per se. I'm worried about, we're all involved in writing stories, and you always sort of wonder why you bother with it after a certain point. The AI to me, as far as writing text, it just seems like some really gross mechanical orgy that's going on.
Yeah.
And I can't see, in 5 years, are we going to be reviewing AI texts, talking about their different merits? Are we going to be recommending AI novels to one another?
If AI, here's the thing. If AI were to accelerate, we talked about this a little bit before the show. There's this idea that technology always goes forward and gets better. Historically, there's no basis for that. So I think it's just as likely that we kind of plateau out, or we lose the ability to control the AI or get useful things out of it. Already, the internet is less useful now than it was 10 years ago. So
sure is.
I think it's quite possible AI would end up becoming such a amalgam of bad code that it just wouldn't be usable in a couple years. And we might be in the sweet spot of like, already people are like, Hardwick Bentho says, I asked ChatGPT for quotes from historical figures on certain subjects, and it gave me a bunch of convincing ones that all turned out to be fake. So is that useful, right? It's not useful. So we may have already passed that sweet spot where we could use the chat programs to go collect a lot of high level sorted information for us that we could use. If it were to accelerate, we wouldn't ever review AI novels, because what would happen is, instead of us trying to find novels we like, we would talk to the AI and say, I want a book that's like this, and it would just write you one. So there would be no need to review an AI book, because people would just have the AI create the art that they wanted to see to begin with.
Well,
do I
let me
think
ask
we'll
you
reach
this
that
then.
point?
How
I don't
many-
really think so, but
How many
That's where we go.
unread books do you have on your phone?
on my phone, I don't
Or
know.
whatever device you
I probably
use.
have a couple. I probably have a
Well,
couple.
I'm always curious about this, because I starting Pilum, we began in 2019, right before we were confined in France. So yeah, it was already working, but we're just trying to figure out how to pass the time. And it's I have some experience as a publisher from in a previous life, and it's strange navigation publishing now, and figuring out why and how you're doing things. So I always I'm always ask people what they're reading, and I check out their bookshelves when I go over to their house for cocktails. Do you've got a physical book that you give away free? I'm real curious how you do that.
Well, I mean, you get the ebook for free, but I have the physical copy.
Oh, okay.
Which people can buy the physical version. I give away the ebook because, well, it doesn't really cost a lot to give away a couple of bytes, right?
Right.
A lot of the price. By the way, guys, just to interject, the price of all the books is going to go up in a couple weeks. So on June 20th, all the prices are going up, and I'm honestly surprised Amazon has put it off as long as they have. But the prices on all the books are going to be more expensive. So if you're wanting to buy one of my books, or really any physical book, now is probably the time to do it before we start to see prices go back up again.
You really want to get in on our crowdfund.
I'll link it real quick.
You really want to see that Deathflex meets its production cost. When we started this out, my idea was, the books are going to cost what they're going to cost. We're not out to make a ton of money. We're really trying to do the best books that we can in terms of design and production. And where we are now is, I can pay about half of my freelancers. So it'd be great within the next 2 weeks if we could push those numbers a bit, because it would certainly limit our losses. I know that's not the kind of thing that people want to hear necessarily, but I'm a big fan of the T word, transparency. I think it's worth being honest about the labor that goes into what we've got going. Anyway, so the idea of opportunity cost and bad money chasing out the good, right? You only have so much space on your bookshelves. And the other question I always ask about people is, how many unread physical books do you have? Stacks?
I have a few. I started doing kind of a little, I don't know. I have a method to controlling my stacks of books, because eventually I had a whole hallway full of like 9-foot bookshelves completely stacked with books like piled up on top of them. I'm like, I gotta get rid of some of these books. So my rule was, if I had read the book and I hadn't reread it and it had sat on the shelf for more than 5 years, I was going to give it away, right? Because chances are I'm never going to read that book again. I didn't find it interesting enough to try to pick it back up at some point. There are books, if I've ever reread a book, if I've read a book twice, it stays on the shelf because I know at some point I'm probably going to want to read it a third time. You know, if a book is good enough for you to read twice, you might want to read it later in life, or you might want to give it to someone to read. And then if I have bought a book to read and I hadn't read it in a year, that goes too, because the truth is I'm making a statement when I buy it. Is like, I wish I was the kind of person who wanted to read this book. And I'm not. I'm the kind of person who doesn't read that book. So off it goes. And I used to buy a lot of books from a used bookstore in Modesto that unfortunately closed this year because of all the stuff after the pandemic. It just lost too much business to keep going. And it was really sad.
It was savage.
But, you know, it was in California. So the whole thing is like they basically shut completely down. And they were good people. They had employees. They kept trying to pay employees, and it was really hard. Anyway, I would go down there and I'd buy just stacks of books and I'd read them. And if I read the first 100 pages and I didn't like it, I'm not finishing the book. I decided that a while back. I'm like, life's too short for me to read books that I think are bad. And in some cases, I read books where I read the first maybe 10 pages, first couple thousand words, and I decided, I don't think this is for me. One that comes to mind was, I think it was called Bitterwood. And I only bought it because the second book was called Dragon Force. And I'm a big Dragon Force fan. I'm like, well, if it's called Dragon Force, there might be something here for me. Yeah, I do like dragons. So the first book opens up with basically like The Purge, but rape, right? Like everybody's raping each other. And I got through that and I paused and I'm like, I don't think I need to read this series. And away that book went, you know? So that's helped me control it a little bit.
So that raises a thing I've been wondering about for people, which is, and I guess for myself too, which is the question of like, how do you choose what you read? Because like for me, and I guess that goes towards deciding what to sell as a book, what to write, right? But for me, it's extremely eclectic. Everything from, I just read a Mac Bolan Executioner novel, and I just bought The Red Sphinx, Alexander Dumas, never completed novel. And I bought a collection of historical documents from the War of 1812 recently. And so it's like, not knowing, you know, it seems like to readers, people are very eclectic and individualistic.
Yeah.
And it's, I know that there's all these genre conventions and certain people who like particular genres, but I find it very difficult to understand how to appeal to any particular reader, I guess.
Yeah, so the conventional wisdom for marketing now in the post-corporate period. By the way, guys, you should read my Substack on the corporate period in the arts. I have a few more parts to that series. I think the whole series is going to run out to about 20,000 words, which to me is just an introduction to my ideas about the history of the corporate period. That's a lot because you could go deep and deep and deep into this, but we're in the post-corporate period, which basically means we're not being patronized by corporations who are buying our art and intending to sell it at a profit. But we're still kind of in a lot of fashions, we're returning to a more pulp-focused thing where there's many genres and many expectations for readers who read those genres and for books to fit into those genres. It's all about reader expectations. The conventional wisdom is that there are readers of a genre, that there are paranormal romance readers, and these are people who read paranormal romance and buy paranormal romance and do a lot of it. And so the conventional wisdom is you should find your niche and write a bunch of books in it, like a 20-book series. If you follow like the 20 books to 50K people and stuff like that. I decided a long time ago I'm not going to do that. And the reason is not just that, at the outset, 20 books seems like a lot. Now I think I've written and published 20 books, but so it doesn't seem that significant now. But more than that, like writing 20 books in one micro genre to try to like slam dunk on a tiny market segment that may not even exist. Like you said, the people who are buying paranormal romance probably read lots of other things too. And we don't know exactly what they're into, but we just know that this micro genre sells a certain amount. To write 20 books in one little micro genre, that to me is a kind of hell, right? Like, if you think of like Dante going through hell and like these punishments that fit it, it's like, your punishment is to write 50 books in a microgenre that you are not particularly interested in so that you can make a tiny bit of money. It's like, there's lots of things you can do for money, and $50,000 seems like a lot when you're 20, but it's not as much when you're middle-aged and you have a career. $50,000 is enough to make a small living. But if you're doing that living, doing something that really taxes you creatively and doesn't fulfill you, well, you might as well just drive a truck, right? I'd rather drive a truck and write fewer books, personally, than write many books in a microgenre. And then the other people are like, well, how come you write horror and you write fantasy and you write science fiction and then you write nonfiction? It's like, the other conventional wisdom is like your author brand is super focused on a genre. That this author writes this genre. And when I like, and most of us have this attitude. What does Stephen King write? Almost everyone will say he writes horror. He's actually written more fantasy books than horror books at this point, right? But everyone thinks of because that's where it started, and that's what his publisher wanted. His publisher wanted lots of horror books. Even a book like The Stand, which is considered a horror book, even though it's really a fantasy book. I mean, there's horror elements for sure. Like, it definitely starts with some horror, but it's definitely more like a fantasy book. But anyway,
I mentioned Mac Bolan and Don Pelton, hundreds of those books, hundreds. You think about that, it's almost like you said, it's almost a Lovecraftian horror of these, the cyclopean ruin of his mind as he had to stack up all those books and write them all. Or like Ian Fleming, which I've been reading a lot of, or rereading most of them these days. He pretty much everything he wrote was James Bond, except for one book, Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, and he wrote for his kid.
Well, he wrote for Reuters as well, didn't he?
Well, yes, he was a newspaper man, so he wrote a lot of copy, I'm sure, for the newspaper. In fact, James Bond was his summer gig, where when he took vacation, he'd go to Jamaica and write a James Bond novel. But he's mostly, his primary writing was James Bond, and that's what everyone knows him for, and he certainly has that brand. Or like J.K. Rowling, she's known for Harry Potter.
Yeah, she's written mysteries, and I say that J.K. Rowling's really a mystery writer because the format of all the Harry Potter novels is a mystery. Just it's in a fantasy universe, and therefore it gets put into this fantasy genre. But the format is really mystery. It feels like a mystery novel. And when you go read her other ones, which are written under Kenneth Galbraith, I think it's Galbraith. Yeah, you'll see the genre connection immediately. Oh, it like clicks because her style in the mystery genre, like the Harry Potter books, one of the reasons people loved them so much is they were mystery novels. Same reason they loved Agatha Christie novels. It really makes you want to turn the page. She has a real mastery over how to get that mystery plot going, get people really interested in figuring out what happens at the end. So yeah, she writes really in one genre. But yeah, anyway, for me, like as an artist who's especially not making a ton of money doing this, it's not, it would be worth it for me, I guess, at a certain point. Like if I was making a lot of money, then yeah, I'd be happy write microgenre romance stuff, but for the amount of work that people do in independent publishing to make the small amount of money they do, focusing on like mermaid fan fiction or something weird like that, it's just not worth it to me. I need to kind of branch out as an artist. And like I'm an eclectic reader, I'm an eclectic writer too. The last book I read was, or really I guess reread, was Brothers Karamazov, right? Was Dostoevsky. And as I'm reading this, it's really fun to go back and read classics after you've been doing the writing thing for a while, because you have a totally different perspective on them. Like, I know why there's no Brothers Karamazov movie. It's like, this entire book is Russians talking to each other about God. Doesn't adapt into like the modern movie format very well, really, or like a soap opera format or anything. It's just interesting to go back and read something like that.
But I wonder if I even think about genre fiction distinctions at all. For me, it's popular fiction and literary fiction. It's the only way for me to make sense of it. I mean, our writers, we're coming out slowly, progressively. Brian is in the first wave, and John is in the second. There's going to be third and fourth and probably a fifth wave before we're done. Anyway, some of the guys in the wave to come are, moving toward the literary side. There are discussions about, what is it like to write outside of the visual mode? And the writer who's been suggesting that this would be an interesting thing to do is a great fan of the brothers Karamazov. So, and I wouldn't be surprised if it was because of that.
Yeah, I think
it's James Joyce writes about the ineluctable mode of the visible. I think that was his phrasing. So even Joyce, who is voice and language first, understands how important it is to be able to manage dramatic beats. That is, people and having impacts on each other in a real space with objects and whatnot.
Yeah. So you bring up something interesting, which is the distinction between popular fiction and, quote, literary fiction, which is something I talk about a little bit, because the 20th century really, the way that we look at music history or art history or literary history is focused on the filter of the literary, like what is romantic literature? Well, something very interesting that happens, and it starts with literature and then kind of branches out into other arts from there, because the first mass media is the written word, where we could print a bunch of copies of the Bible or any other book and it could be popular. Alexander Dumas, Charles Dickens, these guys were kind of rock star writers of their time. They were very popular. People would buy their books in droves, compared to something like painting at the time, which you couldn't replicate really. Like there was no mass painting, right? So when we study art history, we're looking at things that are filtered and a little bit more rare. By the time we get to the 20th century, we have the corporate, which is the popular. And it's products that are designed to be popular, not designed to be artistic works which stand on their own or challenge a tradition or work within some other literary tradition like postmodernism. Popular fiction is designed to be popular. And the way it's designed to be popular is that you have a corporation who wants to sell a product at a profit. So they hire a writer or they buy a story from a writer that they think they can print a bunch of copies of and sell it and then share those profits with the writer in the form of royalties. The very idea of a professional writer really doesn't exist until we have widespread popular fiction. It's pretty rare that any writer from the distant past, at least, was just a writer. They were that and something else. And this was true for musicians in particular. Most musicians were patronized by either the church or someone else.
I'm sorry. I don't want to stop you, but I don't think that being just a writer lasted for very long, ever.
Yeah, I think you're correct.
At best, it's 18th century to middle of the 20th, and that's it.
Yeah, and I think it really runs where, it's a historic anomaly, I guess is the best way I would put it. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that's necessarily bad, because as artists, we want to be passionate about what we're doing. And I think as we exit the corporate period, we look at other forms of patronage. One is Neopatronage, and I guess I could link to Indiegogo again. This is a form of patronage. Rather than having a publishing company, a big corporation, decide to hire a writer and publish something, the people can be the patron. And they don't have to be rich like some feudal lord to hire an orchestra for Handel to write for. They can just contribute a small amount and be the patron of an artist with limited resources. Really, you can work outside of this idea of, and the reason I would say fiction was designed to be popular was you looked at a market segment that liked certain things, and then you would find stories that you thought that market segment would buy a lot of, whether it was mysteries or adventure stories or something else, and then you'd hope to make profit on the other side of it. Whereas literary fiction just has it's working off a little bit different tradition, whether it's modern or postmodern literature.
All publishing is a horse race or Monte Carlo simulator. So it's not, you don't, buy the product of a particular writer with expectation of a particular return. The exceptions are, the top 1-2%.
Yeah, well, I'd say it's
if you look at mid-list books, the way mid-list books work, you place your bets all along your list, and you hope one of them comes in, and all the others are losers.
This is something that talking about the corporate period. This is something that I think is way more is a much bigger deal in the second half of the 20th century, where it really is like a winner take all. Whereas in the pulp era, there was a lot more what people usually call Nash economics, where there's many different little segments. You have lots of here's the weird science fiction magazine that sells a lot of copies. You had
you also had enormous demand then too.
Yeah,
that doesn't exist anymore.
Well, I mean, there's still
no TV.
Yeah, there was no TV. Yeah, I mean, like there's still high demand, but there's not competition from other forms of mass media. Movies were still rare.
Working class
TV.
Men read fiction.
Yeah.
Up until 1990.
Yeah. Yeah, and so anyway, another weird thing about the corporate period with a lot of mass media, I think it's probably much worse as far as movies and things. It's really a winner-take-all thing. It goes from, we're all kind of micro-marketing to winner-take-all. And now with Amazon marketing, it's more like everybody's going to find their little micro-genre and write just for that. I don't really want to do that personally, but I get that some people are excited about the opportunity to do that. It's just a different model now than it was. I suspect, and I haven't crunched all the numbers, but I think a lot of publishing houses now, the bigger publishers, they make, like for instance, Tor. I think they make a lot of their money on their backlog. Their older books that continue to sell well, and then the newer books are mostly, like you said, they strike out. And I think they're striking out a lot more now than they used to strike out because there's more competition, and I think they're also just not trying to publish things people want to read.
When I was at Harcourt Brace, I was aghast. They were the American copyright holders for Virginia Woolf. This is 1993, I guess. And they let it lapse. They did not renew copyright. I went to the editor-in-chief and said, we're doing this? I wasn't a rights manager or anything like that. I just wanted him to tell me that, I wanted to know he was aware that was going on. It was out of my hands. That was the word. So backlist is everything. Only, well, now we're talking about publishing. I mean, this is not what we do at Pylum. I mean, we're a boutique publisher. I'm definitely trying to bring out new voices who have an understanding of how a beat structure, force of composition work together to provide to create affect within popular fiction. So we're trying to get to popular readers. I don't know. I think we read and we write to a certain extent to nostalgia, and my nostalgia is probably since you're from Houston, you know what I mean. Being able to go into half-price books in the mid '80s and sort of rat around in some other person's collection and discover just something.
I'd say the majority of my fantasy collection. You know, I read a lot of stuff outside of fantasy too, but I'd say the majority of it I got at used bookstores. Almost all of the books, almost all of my favorite books I got used. And I'm not sure what exactly that means, but just the way it was is like I felt like maybe I could take more chances if it was $1, you know, instead of
There's
$8.
that. The barrier's very low, but you're also participating in a culture.
Yeah.
You know, culture is being everything that we can't see. You know, you knew what you could get into when you went to a Half Price Books in North Texas anyway, and I assume that the case would be true for Houston. Dallas is, you know, it's John Dacre's territory. It's a very weird place.
I got a super chat from Santa Graver. I just want to say thank you for the $1. I really do appreciate it. There's no message attached to it. It was just $1. So I appreciate the tip. Yeah. And Fiona Wolf mentioned some writers who were mid-listers, even for TradPub, have ended up re-releasing under their own banner later. Yeah. So there, you know, what happens? The books fall out of print, the rights revert, and then you might as well re-release it.
You'll never be reprinted. You've got nothing to lose.
Exactly. Yeah. I bring up this story was John Norman, who wrote the Gore novels, these novels of Gore. His books all fell out of print, not because they weren't popular, but because the editorial staff at whatever his publisher was decided they didn't want to publish those books anymore. So even though they were very profitable, they decided they didn't like him, and he had to wait a number of years for the rights to for those original books to revert back to him, and then he could republish it.
There's definitely capriciousness like that. One of our writers who has a wonderful piece in Death Flax, which is definitely worth the $20 to get the thing sent to you, is Paul Rhodes, who wrote an extended essay on what the title is, What Kind of Artist is Jack Vance? Paul Rhodes, in case you don't know, and I didn't until very recently, it's a funny story. I was looking around for critical work on Jack Vance. I figured there must be some critical reception out there, and there's damn little.
Most of, I mostly know Jack Vance because guys who were into fantasy or were into like Dungeons and Dragons would talk about the Dying Earth, right? And if you've never read any of the Dying Earth stuff and you're into maybe you're into Dungeons and Dragons a little bit, you got to read this. You got to read it. It's totally weird, but it's like a collection of novellas or short stories, really, that explore his weird world and system. It's so influential, but nobody talks about it.
There are 3 books. The first one was Mazarian the Magician. He wrote, I believe, a good part of it during World War II when he was a merchant seaman. Well, the stories gets better. I looked around. I found named Paul Rhodes, and I Googled him, and I found some videos. He's an artist, and he talks about painting, and I was watching his video, and I was looking at the trees, and I was like, that's got to be France. And there's something about the light, and I said, that's got to be the Loire Valley, which is where I live. And so I contacted him, and it turns out he lives an hour and a half away from me. And so he invited me up, and we hung out for a couple of days just talking about. He was a friend of Jack Vance's, and he actually, if you look, I believe Vance's son keeps his catalog in print on an imprint called Splatterlight. Paul re-edited his entire oeuvre, so all of Vance's books were given it's called the Vance Integral Project, and if you come across these volumes, snap them up, because there aren't any anymore. They were beautifully printed in Italy. He worked with Vance to reestablish some editing that was done in them. It's just a wonderful work of curation, really. Anyway, so we've got an excerpt from a forthcoming book from Paul Um, we don't have a title, but it's, I believe we have, I want to say about 15, 16 critical essays on Vance. And so anyone who who appreciates Vance will go nuts for this book. Um, First excerpt will be in Death Flex.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And those editions, like I saw a whole set of them for sale, the complete works. It was like $18,000.
Yeah.
And I was tempted. then I was like, where would I put it?
Well,
but I couldn't justify it. But they're things of beauty.
David, you were talking about niches and how Amazon encourages that sort of very focused attention on it's kind of like a Monte Carlo simulation in reverse. Yeah, that exists. I'm inspired by the kind of work that Paul did, where he really put down stakes, and this is the hill I'm dying on. I'm going to re-edit all of Vance's back, his back catalog, which had reverted to him in his old age.
Mm-hmm.
And I think books are becoming more and more, I don't know. I was talking about this with Sky Hernstrom earlier today about this. Sky works in a library. He's a librarian. And he was talking about this new writer he had found. And I was like, well, did you find him online or something? Oh, no. He's his kid who works for me. And I realized that we're in Fahrenheit 451. The people who like books, you want to find out about anything, you got to go to a library. Pretty soon, that's where writers will meet.
Yeah.
To get away from AI.
Because the internet won't work anymore.
Well,
and books will be continuously edited for PC-ness by AI.
Yeah, Brian's got a great piece in IM 1776 about. Did you see it?
David, yeah, I have it. I'll link it right here. The valorization of everything.
Yeah.
Here, I'll link it right real quick.
That's coming. It's coming to film too sooner than we expect.
Oh, I completely agree and understand. I found out because one of the guys who's in chat, Hardwick Bintho, pointed out to me that apparently all the Hardy Boys books had been Bowdlerized back in the 60s and 70s. Now, I didn't know this.
Yeah.
I have some of the original editions, and I went and checked this. I had one called Footprints Under the Window. And turns out that in, I don't know, 1969, 1970, they just rewrote a book. They wrote a different book and put that name on it. It's a completely different book. They kind of started with some of the same ideas, but it's not the same story at all. It's just a different book. So if you want to read Footprints Under the Window, you have to somehow go seek out one of those 1930 or whatever original hardback editions that were, there's a bunch of them, but you have to somehow go find that book and get it.
Your childhood is fungible.
Yeah, and I also remember, there was, this made the news for a day and a half, was they took down all of these Dr. Seuss books, right? I saw it on Mulberry Street was one of them because of offensive stereotypes or something. And this is an important thing, is not only did they stop publishing them, not only did they stop selling them on Amazon, but you'll get banned from eBay for selling them on eBay, right? So all of your online sites that you would use to trade the old books, you will get banned for selling the old books, depending on, the whims of the people who happen to be in charge. That's the new kind of corporate kleptocracy, or I don't know, corporateocracy.
As a publisher, you ask yourself, what are you, I always ask, why are you doing this? I mean, one of the things I'm most proud of since 2019, we have been able to get our books into libraries. So, we are in the library cataloging. So, libraries nowadays, they just order a book that's completely set up, for circulation, right? They don't do any of the actual, Mylar covering or, putting the tag of the, I guess it's nice, but the barcode. They don't do any of that. It's all set up. But we have, by hook and by crook, been able to get into that service. So if you wanted to read Shagduk and you didn't want to shell out the money for it, you could go to the library. And I would almost rather you do it. Go to the library and ask the circulation librarian to just go ahead and order that book, because readership matters, I think, quite a bit.
So
go ahead.
I have a little anecdote, because I have it in this book, is the basically a breakdown in our ability to use libraries and find things in libraries. This is, I mean, it's almost satirical the way I present it, but the library at the university. So one of the main characters, he's a university professor, and of course the only other people that are in the library are other university professors, and they can't find the books they're looking for. And this was something that I experienced when I taught at Fresno State years ago, was that I'd go down and I would go to the stacks, and you'd use a computer to look up where something was, and it wouldn't be there. And so you go to the librarian and you'd be like, I'm looking for this volume of the American Journal of Musicology. And they'd be like, okay, well, it's over here. And I'd be like, I looked there and it's not there. In fact, there's a bunch of books that aren't anything close to that. And so they'd physically go over there and be like, well, I don't know where it is. It's lost. We can't find the book. And this was happening for lots of things, that things got misplaced in stacks. You relied on a computer to remember where it was in the stacks based on like a really advanced version of a Dewey Decimal System. But if there wasn't somebody physically maintaining that order, then books disappeared from the library.
Well,
you couldn't find
things. The library I worked in St. Louis was was very funny, because that was a common problem with faculty. The circulation librarian, had shelving assistants, and they were I think they had handicapped kids coming in and doing that, and she understood how they misshelved. She understood the pattern of their errors. So you would say, well, I'm looking for this book on musicology, and it's 3 shelves down and to the right of where it should be, because Chester did it.
That reminds me of when I was a kid, and back in the old card catalog days, in the 70s. There were certain books that I really liked, and I wanted them to be available to me. And so I would both put them in places that they weren't supposed to be, that I knew where they were. But there were a few where I actually took the card out of the catalog and just stuck it in my pocket. No one's looking this one up. And of course, they can do that en masse now at a whim on all these library databases. Just disappear a book out of it. And it is kind of...
Nobody does cataloging anymore.
And it's really essential. That's like an essential part of figuring of it's not just that the knowledge exists. You have to be able to go look at it for it to be useful in any kind of sense. So cataloging is extremely important. Of course, my degree's in music, and the ability to catalog a certain composer's work so that you knew what piece you were looking at and where to get it and where the original was, like, this was important stuff, because music got lost. And it was a big deal if you found a manuscript that might have been JS Box, but we don't know where it goes in the catalog now. Maybe we have to redo the numbers. And
I've got another question for you. So what's it like buying music on Amazon for you?
You mean like recordings of music, or you mean like sheet music?
Yeah, no, I'm buying a physical copy of a CD. I don't know, Bruckner or something.
I haven't. First of all, I got a super chat from Darth Kilhoon. I thank you for the $2. I really appreciate it. Take Money, good listen for a long drive. I appreciate it. Thanks for listening. So I liked buying physical CDs from Amazon. That's one of the things that actually made me an Amazon customer, was that I found in the early 2000s, they sold CDs that you just simply couldn't get in stores. And a lot of them, my interests were very obscure. If you wanted to find classical music, you could only get it from Amazon, because it would be some pressing of something that someone did in the 80s. You know, there weren't a lot of classical music recordings around 20 or 30 years ago that were accessible and easy to find. Or heavy metal, right? If you wanted to listen to a band from Sweden, Amazon is the only place you could buy a physical copy.
So here's a question.
I was fishing for a particular response, because their database has gotten so bad.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, I should follow it up. I haven't bought anything from them in a long time. I buy directly from the bands now.
Yeah, well, good for you.
Which I prefer. Buy from their Bandcamp, or, you know. So I tend to buy directly from the publisher, or the label, I guess, the publisher or the band.
I mean, we're talking about misfiled things, and you know, consumption of physical media. Amazon's records are so poor. They, you know, a particular recording or a particular edition of a book, very often concatenated with another one.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're looking for a particular recording, J.B. Jackson, the author of Shagduk, can go for hours on this subject. It is impossible, damn near impossible. If you know something exists in the world, and you go look for it, that particular recording, you might even get it. You might even get it. But, you know, back when you were buying physical media, and you know, I haven't bought physical media, you know, a recording from Amazon for ages, so I wouldn't know. But I take Jackson's word for it. That's a big problem, because, you know, not only do they fiddle with their electronic selections. I mean, it's a hilarious irony that the first book that they took off of people's Kindles was 1984. I mean,
Yeah.
Didn't tell anyone, right? So not only we have selective access to, you know, things that we've bought, they can boulderize it without us knowing. And even finding it is like trying to find little Brian Renninger's favorite book in the juvenile section in Juneau, Alaska.
Well,
Yeah.
but that goes back to the discussion about the used bookstores, because part of the culture of books was searching for books. Before there were any of these databases or online things. You know, it was a mark of pride to say,
yeah, we'd go through and look, and here's something that looks cool. And
yeah, I remember, like, in the 70s, you know, late 70s, when I was a kid, we went to Hawaii, and I found a copy of Michael Moorcock's Chronicles of Coram in a used bookstore. No, and of course, I'm from Alaska. There's like my town, there were 2 bookstores. Now there's only 1 bookstore.
Yeah.
So it was really hard to find things, and I knew Chronicles of Coram existed, but the idea of actually owning a copy was almost amazing to me. Like this, we'll be back to physically searching for items again.
Yeah,
except
it's
they'll
gonna
all
be
be
interesting.
electronic.
And
Yeah.
we're going to all meet physically at the library.
That's the other way to do it.
Wednesday.
And the problem with music is the same with comics, where the databases have not kept up with the abilities to find things, particularly with comics. And I think the same thing with music is, like, you want to look things up by the people who contributed to them, right? You want to be able to go to a database and say, give me every comic that was penciled by Gene Colan. Give me every comic that was written by, I don't know, Doug Mennix or whatever. There's no way to do that. You'd think they would have come up with that. Or for a recording, give me this composition, this symphony, and this director, or whatever. It's really hard.
Yeah, with music, there's a couple like really notable examples that have happened that now it's I don't know, it might be hard to find the original. So one of them is actually it's Ozzy Osbourne. He went back, and when he re-released some of his early albums, he actually had studio musicians in like 2000 whatever 2005 or something, come back in and record over the drums and the bass. And because they had the masters, they just took those out and recorded them with different. Why did they do that? Because if they reprinted the album, they'd have to pay royalties again to those two band members, who they, Ozzy, or not, probably his wife at the time, Sharon, they didn't like them. So they didn't want to pay them royalties, so they just paid union wage for a couple of dudes that played in Ozzy's band to come in and re-record all the parts. And the only people who knew this were people who happened to have the original recordings. And they're like, oh, cool, a remaster. And they put it on like, this doesn't sound right. Everything is different. It's not just produced different. Those are not the drums from 1980, right? That's not correct. But yeah, he had re-recorded the parts. The only original parts were his voice and the guitars.
I think it back. We're living in a Philip Dick novel, of course.
Yeah, it's wild.
J.G. Ballard novel.
Yeah, the other famous one was Megadeth, where they lost parts of the original recordings, but they decided to do a remaster anyway. So Dave Mustaine went back in and re-recorded a bunch of vocals and stuff. And so if you go listen to Rust in Peace, you go, hey, Amazon Alexa, play me Rust in Peace by Megadeth. You're not going to hear what the album sounded like. You have to go find the original CD if you want to hear what it sounded like, because the parts are all different. It's been changed.
That's interesting.
And I thought like maybe Dave Mustaine was like embarrassed about some of his vocal performance because frankly there's some warts on it, right? So maybe he's like, I could do it better now. So we'll just re-record it.
My voice is more wrecked, right?
Yeah. So I don't know. I don't know what he was thinking to do that, but it's not correct. And the tempos are different in some cases. It's like, this is not a remaster. This is just you just kind of chopped up your old stuff in Pro Tools and redid it for some reason.
He pulled the George Lucas.
Yeah. Yeah, George, that's another one. Yeah, like George, I'm not going to let you see the original theatrical cuts of Star Wars. That's rather weird. I mean, it's your movie, so I guess you could change it yourself. It wasn't really bowdlerized so much as like, I don't know, he added things to it that he kind of wished he could do in the 70s. Oh, I really wish I could have done this in the 70s. Well, you couldn't. And part of the charm of the movie is that you found ways to do things you couldn't do back then.
Yeah. And, that's like with my article, part of the thing is like at some point you're changing history and not just changing your own work. And I'm not sure where that line gets drawn. I know it is drawn when the author dies, but there's some point even when you're still alive when you're like, this isn't the same thing anymore.
Yeah, there's a famous composer. Well, famous is the wrong word because probably no one's heard of him. Charles Ives. Charles Ives formed the Ives Company, which is an insurance company, and that's how he made his fortune. But he was also a composer of modern music in, I guess, what we call the modern style. He would have like big fan machines as part of the music. Like he did weird stuff. He'd have music for player pianos, all blasting in different keys and stuff. We don't know what his early music sounded like. Not because it got lost to time, but because he went back as a middle-aged man and recomposed all of it and destroyed all the originals. So we have no idea how he wrote music when he was 21, when he was first writing this really crazy music where we have photographs of it. We have photographs of the performances, but we don't know what it sounded like because he went back and rewrote it and re-edited it when he was an older man and probably a better composer. But
I think there's a morbid fascination that installs itself. That a writer or musician does that because he's thinking about immortality, and he's looking at earlier works, thinking, "Oh well, all I see are errors now, and if I can just redress the errors, then God will see me and it will be more perfect and it will last longer." I think that's the instinct. I think it's wrong-headed. What's that?
Frank Frazetta used to do that with his paintings too.
Really?
There's a famous painting, I forget which, on one of the Conan novels where Conan's in the middle of a big battle and he's strangling a guy. Well, he later went and totally changed the Conan figure until he was, killing the guy with an axe. It's a total different composition of Conan. All the surrounding scene is the same, but he did not like that original composition.
I think Conan is the white hot center of contemporary culture. I think he's the
Clearly.
most contested figure ever.
Actually, I had a question for you, Neil, on one of the other stories in Deathflex is J.B. Jackson's. I forget the title of it.
Der Schleim.
Der Schleim, right?
Inquisition of Der Schleim.
Did I hear correctly that there is a bit of a crossover with that and Shagduck, that they're related?
Yeah, there's not Shagduck, but the sequel, which is I should have a draft of that from Jackson this summer sometime. I'm gonna have this really busy summer because that should get the sequel. I believe it's called Korlach. And Der Schleim in Deathflex is an excerpt from that. It's fantastic.
Interesting.
George Leake said it reminded him of I.B. Singer. So we're definitely popular fiction, but there's a lot. There are a few English degrees kicking around in our ranks too. So I have that novel that Jackson's going to deliver. The Paul Rhodes book. Skylar Hernstrom is going to deliver a book to me, maybe by fall, maybe in the fall. Jeffro Johnson's amazing reprise of How to Win at D&D, Winning Secrets will.
He's in the chat right now on YouTube. So.
Oh, is he?
Oh,
yeah, I should link. Yay. I should link How to Win at D&D. Appendix N is also a really cool, the kind of lost literary history of Dungeons and Dragons.
Well, there wouldn't be a Pylon Press if Jeffro hadn't written that book. I, of course, had read all of those books.
Yeah.
It was vexing to me that nobody else seemed to, that they needed introduction.
But, yeah, they all got memory hold like about, I don't know, 1990 or something. I could only find these books in, like I said, in used bookstores, stacked in. I never saw Michael Moorcock in a bookstore because I was mostly going to bookstores. Like, the bookstores, not to get too deep into this, but bookstores went from kind of like a specialty thing to like Borders and Barnes & Noble at some point in the mid-90s, and they didn't have any of that stuff in there. I had to go to a used bookstore to find that stuff.
The inflection point was 1980 with the Sword of Shannara.
Oh, yes.
That's when things went off the rails.
Yes.
John.
Well, I was going to say that I'm a Gen Y guy. I was born in the mid-'80s, and when I was growing up and I somehow caught the fantasy bug, I was pointed towards, the Lord of the Rings and also the Shannara, however you pronounce it, books. So discovering Appendix N through Jeffro opened my eyes. I'm almost angry at everyone I knew when I was a kid. Why weren't you pointing me to this stuff?
Yeah.
That's not why you're angry, but...
Well, I feel lucky because when I was a kid in the 70s, in Alaska, in our small town in Alaska, our little tiny library we had, there was this one hallway by the bathrooms it was narrow. As a kid, I had to walk mostly sideways through it. But on that wall of that hallway was all the paperback fantasy and science fiction books. And whoever worked in that library loved science fiction and fantasy, and they had books that I've not seen anywhere else ever again, including I forgot the name of it now off the top of my head, but it's if you saw True Detective season 1, if you remember, there's the whole thing with the weird sticks in there. And those weird sticks were inspired by Carl Edward Wagner's story, Sticks.
yeah.
And Carl Edward Wagner was inspired by the art in this book collections of Manly Wade Wellman's work that was illustrated, and the illustrator put sticks in every illustration. Um, and they had that book, which was a very small press book at the time, and it was right there in the little hallway when I was a kid, and I'd look through it and terrified by the illustrations.
It was put there only for you.
Yeah.
That's sort of our mission too. It's like we want you to pick these things up and resonate with them. It's got to be a vibe.
It kind of reminds me too, like I don't know, I made a video on one of the Michael Moorcock books I had, and I had like the original DAW paperback of whenever it was published, and I was like, oh, it's great, you know, I got this used for like $1.55, you know, and people were like, what? This thing sells for like $150. I'm like, what? Like, come on. They're like, look it up. I'm like, oh my gosh, people are selling these garbage paperbacks from the 70s for like $50 to $100 because you just can't find the physical copies of the books anymore. I'm like, there had to be a million of these out there.
Like 40 times that. You know,
oh, clearly.
I mean, you get in on them now.
So yesterday I was at the used bookstore. I got these two, Paul Anderson. This is the second and third volume of The Last Viking, which I had never read before.
I haven't read that one yet.
Seen on the shelf ever before either. They didn't have volume 1. I'm looking online today. Volume 1's going for $40. These were selling for like $3.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, do I spring for volume 1? Probably not.
Yeah, I had one that was. I had another Paul Anderson one. What was it called? The High Crusade, where the Crusaders go into the alien spaceship, and it's a great. It's a great story.
Appendix N book. Appendix N book.
Yeah, it's one of my favorites, and like, you know, I bought it used for like a couple dollars, and I bought it online, right? So I bought, I don't know, some version of it, and they sent me that 70s awful book cover that doesn't show anything. It's just like round spears and stuff. So I pulled it out. I'm like, this is a great example. We're like, what happened to book covers? I'm like, book covers were not always good. There was plenty of great books with terrible book covers back in the day, and this was one of them.
Well, like Carl Edward Wagner's character Cain. I think the first published book of Cain, Cain's a pale guy with red hair, and the first cover has a black guy, you know, in barbarian loincloth, you know, doing something. And it's like, this is not Cain.
You know how all those covers got done, right? I mean, they commissioned art and just put it in a file cabinet. It's like, well, we have a pub date coming up, and you pulled it out and you did typography over it, and there you go.
Yeah, and I tried to communicate. I've tried to communicate that point to a lot of people. They're like, well, you know, this cover that this designer did, it didn't have the right bicycle that my character rides. It's like, okay.
People get mad.
It's like, this isn't that important. Once the person's reading the book, they're not going to turn to the cover and be like, this cover doesn't match. Into the garbage. You know, right. It doesn't work that way. You find it so that it mostly represents what people can expect in the book, and you call it good. I've done it many times myself. So,
in terms of visual offerings, I forgot to mention. I think we have 6 books coming up. I just contracted a book called "Only Bastards Die Twice" by the young David Liu out of Copenhagen, Denmark. So he is finishing up high school right now as we speak, and the kid is fantastic. So, you know, really, that'll be our first graphic novel down the road. So, you know, again, our crowdfund for the anthology is all about operating expenses. We'll end up doing a Kickstarter for all of these titles, because if you know a different way to do this, contact me and tell me. I mean, I'd love it. And if you have, I don't know, if you're rich and you sort of like seeing this kind of publishing happen, just, you know, fork over $10,000 or so, and that will be good for a long time on that. Extremely economical.
Yeah. So Neopatronage. I've had Brian Niemeyer multiple times on the show, and we've talked about this. Is that as we as sort of the power of, I guess, big companies to manage this market wanes and there's more opportunities for outside voices, the new model really is distributing the patronage of artists so that the regular person is patronizing the artist directly, or more directly than in the old way. Like, you could support this Indiegogo and you're patronizing Pylon Press, but also the artists that are in that book, rather than a publisher kind of like you said, like Vegas stakes. We're going to roll the dice and hope this book sells, which, I mean, that's part of the game. In this case, you really can sell it directly to people and cultivate a relationship with the people who want to read the book. I'm super thankful for YouTube for that too, because I know the people who read my books in a much more direct fashion versus a kind of a roundabout method where you eventually make a book and bring it to market and hope people read it. It's more, there's a much more direct relationship there. And there's even potential for more old style kinds of patronage where, like, in the 18th century, most musicians they didn't put on public concerts and sell tickets to make money. They had some aristocrat who paid them to exist because they liked the music to exist. Or in the case of George Frederick, in the case of Haydn, you had a patron that even wanted to participate in the orchestra, things like that. Wanted to have parts written that he could enjoy playing because he enjoyed the art for its own sake. That's actually really cool, and we could have more of that happen. You could have we should be cultivating more relationships with people who are tech billionaires so that they can directly be patrons to important works of art. I don't know.
Because I'm geographically remote, I don't, I'm personable enough to try to do that cultivation, but I can't get on the plane to do it.
Yeah.
Our strategy has been really to build a brand. It's a terrible word that came around in the early 90s. To have an identifiable look and an identifiable style, and yet be wide enough to interest a lot of people. So the idea would be, there's an art to publishing and to editing as well. It's not, I think right now, Nick Cole actually wrote the introduction to our second book, Wells of Urn. If you don't know, Nick is the one who put the idea of, he's among those who put the idea of doing what you're doing, David, just going straight to your reader. Why not? And he did it with great elan and success. And I think that right now there's a great deal of energy for that. There are people leaning into that, you among them. I wish you all the greatest success. The more independent voices that get out there, the better. There are some things that a publisher can do, and it's not like when I was working at Harcourt Brace where I had Harcourt letterhead. I could write people and say, hey, send me a book, and they would be really happy about that. And I could pick and choose. I mean, I don't have that kind of juice now.
Yeah.
But that kind of thing gets built. It doesn't get built in 4 years even. So
it takes time.
We're going in the right direction, which is when we started out, that was the idea. It's not just me, by the way. There are other impoverished eminence grise behind me. I'm
gonna give some advice to the people who are reading this that I know are writers. And some of this advice comes from this book. I hate to always be plugging myself, but that's the life. Keys to Prolific Creativity. One of the best things you can do as a writer is just to do a lot of writing. You're not going to figure out who your audience is or what people want from you or how bad you are at certain things unless you're practicing. It's like, just get there and start doing it, right? And a lot of people are like, well, I've known independent artists who spend 7 years trying to publish their first book. You would have been better to take that first book, put it in a drawer, and forget about it for 7 years, and then publish, and then take a look at it and try to revise it. It takes years to build up any kind of presence. So many people put out a book and then no one reads it, and they're like, "Oh no!" Their spirits get crushed because they expected to win the lottery. I guess it takes a long time. You have to put out a lot of stuff, guys. So don't be afraid to write. Don't be afraid to just do the practice. Don't be afraid to put yourself out there and see what people think of what you're doing. And you never know, you might have something really special that is maybe you can't even see what's there. But the main thing is it takes time, and the way that you're going to do it is just by doing it, guys. You got to practice. As Brian Niemeyer says, you got to get the suck out. He says it takes about 1 million words. You got to spend about 1 million words writing to stop being bad at what you're doing. And I could probably second that opinion. It took me quite a lot of writing before I even figured out how to recognize what was bad about what I was doing, you know? So anyway, guys, just do it.
Yeah. Yeah, and on that topic, Neil's really great at helping you with that. I'd have to say for sure. He's I certainly felt lucky to have been edited by him, because otherwise his services would have come at great cost. I think if I had,
what makes you think they didn't come at great cost?
Well, they did for you, but no, I mean to me. but you know, like if I had to seek someone out with your skills and hire them to do that, one, it would be extremely hard just to find the person.
It's just being present. You know, it's like everyone I've worked with, I don't ever feel special about it, except that they're present to me. And so, you know, you give it your best whack. And it's just being the person who's there, you know, to receive whatever's going on. You know, as an editor, you know, I've worked with some pretty hardball people, and I'm probably not as hardball as they are, but you know, I do try to tell it like it is. And you know, David, earlier you were saying, you know, reading, you would read the first 100 pages of something. It's like I used to say, well, I'll read the first predicate clause, and you know, if it's okay, then I'll check out the next, you know, the rest of the phrase. But
that used to be a thing with like agent queries and stuff. I mean, I'm dating myself by talking about agents. But anyway, you used to send the first either 10 pages or like 5,000 words, and you had to be able to dunk it on those 5,000 words, or like you weren't getting a reply. That's how it was. So yeah, it's good to. I try to give everything a chance. Not every great book has a great opening line, but if I give you 100 pages or even 10 pages and feel like there's nothing going for it, then I'm probably going to put it down. And there's probably a lesson in that too. Anyway, we're starting to run out of time, guys. So let's make sure we're plugging what we need to plug before we get out of here. We've been on for almost 2 hours, so I've enjoyed it a lot. All right, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and link. I linked the Indiegogo again. So this is for Deathflex. This is Pylon Press New Voices number 3. And then I think I have a link here for, what is it, volume 2 here. Is this it? What's volume 2?
Yeah, it'll be volume 1 and 2, the New Voices. Volume 1 is The Penultimate Men. I've got a story in there that's a mashup between Harlan Ellison's A Boy and His Dog and Charlotte's Web. It's real good.
Okay.
Then The Wells of Ur, Dreams of a Lost City, introduced by Nick Cole. The first one's introduced by Misha Burnett, who has a Kickstarter up right now, and you should check him out and back his book of short stories. He's not a Pylon Press author, but you should back him. And then Deathflex. Of course, you can get Shagduck at Target. You go onto
Yeah.
the Target website and type in Shagduck. You can order it there. So,
Technically, guys, you can get Water of Awakening from Target too. I think I've seen it there. Seen it on their website. So if you want to get one of my books, there's a couple at Target too. Fiona Wolf says, I thought I'd only get 3 to 5 readers for my series, but after a few years now, I'm astonished I have 40 plus now. Yeah, just it builds up over time. Jeffro Johnson, aspiring writers today should go into this with the correct assumption they are functionally illiterate. I didn't realize like how little I knew until I got out of high school and realized that like I just hadn't been taught for like the last 5 years. I had like, in 5 years I had one teacher, and that doesn't mean I had one teacher for 5 years. Right. So I just got out and had to do a lot of work to figure that out, especially in the university system where like I still had old professors back then that would really bust you if you wrote badly. They're like, this is bad. You have to rewrite all of it. Oh,
yeah, it's painful. The joke around the water cooler is nobody reads.
Yeah. Before you write anything, read 50 books from before 1980, 50 more from before 1940, another 50 more from the 19th century. I would say, I don't always put like hard numbers on things, but Stephen King said if you don't have time to read, you don't have time to write. You should be reading a lot of stuff. And the other thing is I don't put like numbers on read this many. Read books that you find interesting and good. There's something from any time period that is worth reading and which will really grip you. There's plenty of 19th century stuff that's really good. A lot of people who, grew up in the public school system, if you hand them a 19th century book, if you hand them Charles Dickens, they're going to recoil a little bit, or they're going to cross their eyes when they read it because they're not used to the level that he writes at or the way that he writes. But there's going to be something else. You could read the Leatherstocking Tales or something, which are 19th century but are really easy to read and are a lot of fun to read. By
Cooper.
James Fenimore Cooper. Thank you. For some reason I started thinking of Mark Twain because Mark Twain wrote this crazy essay on how bad James Fenimore Cooper was, which is a pretty funny read if you ever pick it up. And it's really stupid. When you read it, it's like it's what Mark Twain. I'm like, you're an angry old man that you didn't sell enough books or something, right? He's like, this person jumps off a bridge and lands on a steamboat and he would have broken his legs. I'm like, come on. Anyway, the essay is also fun to read, but I guarantee you there's something from the 19th century to read. I tell people to read Ivanhoe, and then they're like, I don't know, I read this whole book. I read this whole page about his table, and I was wondering why I was reading this book. I'm like, the table's really good, though.
If you like Howard, you've got to read Scott.
Yeah.
The other thing is, if you're not into fiction, read old nonfiction. It's often wonderfully written. Mm-hmm. Like I try to find old engineering manuals because they often have more interesting and more useful stuff than the new stuff.
Yeah, I read old economics books. Old economics books are great. They're so like wonderfully written and detailed and like, whoa, now I understand how everything works.
And down to earth. They're not just like theory.
You see how men have retreated from fiction.
For sure.
It's terrible. I understand why you do it. I understand.
Yeah. Jeffrey Johnson says Alexander Dumas, great adventure stories. Ivanhoe, I really love Ivanhoe. I've had so many people like I can't read Ivanhoe. I'm like, I don't know, man, just give it a shot. Once you kind of get into the rhythm of the style and it just kind of goes. It's kind of like listening to Shakespeare. I tell people they should watch or listen to Shakespeare, not just read it, because it was meant to be performed. And well, I can't understand what they're saying. I'm like, just give it some time for you to get used to the way that the what is he writing in it? Iambic pentameter, to the feel of the verse, and then the story will be able to really kick in. You'll be able to listen to Shakespeare or watch it and understand what's going on.
And read Tristram Shandy because it has a great appendix about fortifications.
All right, so I've read the Mark Twain essay, but never any of the actual James Fenimore Cooper's books. Twain's criticisms were probably why I'd never tried reading any. Last of the Mohicans is a classic for a reason. It's a great adventure story, great characters. I think it's a really easy series to read.
There are writers out there who want to spoil things for you too.
Yeah.
I mean, Twain certainly wanted to he wanted to piss all over Kipling as well.
Oh, Rudyard Kipling.
But, you know, a more contemporary example would be Ursula Le Guin trying to fan you off of Dunsany.
Oh, yes. Lord Dunsany is good.
Another Fenimore Cooper that's well worth reading is one called Wing on Wing, which is a sailing novel set in the Mediterranean in the Napoleonic Wars. And a lot of it takes place around the island of Elba. And I read it when I was in Elba, and the descriptions of Elba totally match the geography. And it turns out he wrote it when he was on vacation in the Mediterranean.
That's cool.
Like, I don't know if they had the income tax, but it was almost like a tax write-off book. I was working, dang it.
All right. So I think that's about it. John, you've been a little bit quiet the last few minutes. You still there?
Yeah, I'm still here. I would also say read G.K. Chesterton, but that's kind of my little soapbox, so I'll get off it.
And, you know, he's a great essayist, too, or a great nonfiction read as well. Same thing with C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis's nonfiction is very much worth reading as well as his fiction. All right. Anything else before we call it a night? Thanks for hanging out. I know we went a little bit longer than we planned, but sometimes it goes that way. There's so much to talk about. Anyway,
thank you. That was a lot of fun.
I have linked the Indiegogo. Death Flex. Do it the death metal.
Thank you.
Death Flex.
That's the way it's meant.
Yeah, it's the game of staying pronunciation.
All right, and I'll link my free book. You can get a free copy of Demoness Machina. That's my free book for this year. Usually I have like a free book that rotates in and out. It's a shorter book. Should be able to read it in 2 hours. Part of my attempt to master what I call the 2-hour book, which is really just the pulp era novella. So anyway, check that out, and we'll see you guys next time. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I appreciate all the super chats, and you guys have a great day.